Sure appreciate all of you taking some time today, and for those of you watching the webinar and a recording after the fact, to get to know the Worker Protection Standard, which applies to agricultural operations in Oregon and around the country. Now, the WPS, the Worker Protection Standard, is not brand new. It was passed the first time back in 1994, and in 2015, it was updated for the first time in over 20 years. So there are some pieces of this regulation that are new. Some things might be a reminder for you folks. I hope you do speak up with questions so that we can get your questions answered on this webinar today. I should mention I work with Oregon State University in the Department of Environmental and Molecular Toxicology, and I'm joined today by my colleague Kimberly Brown, who also works in the Pesticide Safety Education Program in Oregon State University Extension. A few more things about my background. I've been doing WPS training for trainers, workers, handlers. Those are some terms we're going to get to know in the webinar today, and for employers around the state. And I had the honor of being the primary author for the WPS Respirator Guide and the Quick Reference Guide. I'm also on the national level the deputy director of the Pesticide Educational Resources Collaborative. That's a cooperative agreement between EPA, UC Davis, and OSU. So we have funding to produce those national level resources on the Worker Protection Standard and other topics. We've put out some great videos, manuals, posters, and other things. So you'll hear me talk about that throughout the presentation as well. Now, this is the PERC website. I'm going to refer to it several times. If you're in front of your computer, you might even open up another tab and open up pesticide resources .org. This is where you can find basically your homepage for all kinds of neat stuff about WPS, frequently asked questions, guides, training videos, all kinds of things. And you'll notice right here on the upper part of that website, you can sign up for email updates. If you want to know when there's new stuff coming out about WPS, especially things like the online training course for Train the Trainer, that's coming in the next month or two, you want to be notified, so sign up for email updates. Moving forward, this is a picture of some WPS training we've been doing just this summer in English and Spanish for pesticide handlers around the Willamette Valley. We focused this summer on nursery workers because there are so many hand laborers doing work in nurseries. Over the next couple of years, we have funding from ODA through the Specialty Crop Block Grant Program to continue this training effort around the state. So I encourage you to be checking in with pesticideresources.org. And if you're interested in having a training event somewhere at your ag property or maybe in your ag association, do get in touch with us. And my email address will be at the end of the presentation. Moving on. Now, when does the WPS apply? It only applies on agricultural establishments where ag pesticides are used. You can tell it's an ag pesticide if you look on the product label and you see this box, the agricultural use requirements box. You'll notice just in the first line of that box, it says to use this product only in accordance with its labeling and with the Worker Protection Standard. By doing that, they've basically sucked the whole WPS right onto the label. So if we fail to do things according to the WPS, like signage or record keeping, emergency assistance, essentially it means we've used this pesticide in a manner inconsistent with its labeling. And for you licensed applicators in the audience, I think you all probably know using a pesticide in a manner inconsistent with its labeling is against the law. The label is the law. So does this count on organic operations? Yes. Does this apply to restricted use pesticides and general use pesticides? Yes. Look for this ag use requirements box, and if that product is being used on an agricultural establishment, that means the whole Worker Protection Standard applies. For those of you thinking, well, I'm not so sure it applies to me because I heard there was an immediate family exemption. That is true. I want to draw your attention to the How to Comply manual. There's a link that we have available, and we're going to pop it up on the screen for you right now. If you turn to pages 88 and 91 at that link, you'll read all about the immediate family exemption. There are some key points I want to make here about that immediate family exemption. If a farm or a nursery or a forest operation or one of those kind of establishments is more than 50% owned by members of the same immediate family, and that could be spouses, kids, parents, steps, fosters, in-laws. Immediate family is very broadly defined. Then that means there are certain exemptions that apply to the owners and the members of their immediate family. Things to know about that: all of the owners and their immediate family members are exempt from several provisions of the Worker Protection Standard, but all non-family members must receive those full WPS protections. So if you have any employees that come on the property and do work related to the production of agricultural plants on your establishment, those non-family members must receive all of the full WPS protections that we're going to talk about on the webinar today. If you do have family members working with you, I would draw your attention to page 91 on that How to Comply manual, so you can read about those provisions that still apply to you, the owners, and to your immediate family members. Things like the respiratory protection program, following the pesticide label and the restricted entry intervals. Those kind of things are non-negotiable. They're not part of the family exemption. But otherwise, on pages 88 to 91, you can read about those things that don't apply to the owners and their immediate family members. Now, moving on, let's look at this whole universe of what the WPS applies to. It includes farms, of course, but production forestry, sod farms, orchards, everything you see on this list. And also, I should mention that when we talk about pesticides, I don't mean just insecticides. Pesticide is an umbrella term that includes insecticides, herbicides, fungicides, rodenticides, nematicides, algicides, basically any chemical that you might apply in order to control a pest. That's a pesticide, and you should be checking that label to see if there's an agricultural use requirements box. And if there is, and that's the case for lots of products that are especially used in organic and conventional farming, then the WPS applies to you. Are there some exceptions? Yes, there are. They had to draw the line somewhere with where this regulation applies and where it does not. There are some other labor regulations that apply outside of the agricultural space, so they tried not to overlap. So it does not apply when you use an ag use pesticide on non-agricultural plants. An example of that might be if you're using an herbicide that you sometimes use in agriculture, but you could also use it in the parking lot to clean up weeds or along the roadside or a fence line. Those roadside and fence line applications and the ones to the parking lot, those are not subject to the WPS because they're not being used in agricultural production. Also, agricultural use pesticides that are attractants or repellents and traps, it's just a tiny amount, so the potential for exposure is very low. Any ag use pesticides that are used post-harvest, and that means after the plant has been removed from the space where it grew. If you work in a nursery, the harvest could be considered the moment that that plant leaves the property, because it takes its, if it's in a container, it might bring its soil with it. So you're not necessarily harvesting it out of the soil, but you're harvesting it out of the place where it grew and it's leaving the property. Pasture and rangeland where forage will not be harvested are exempt. I'll say that again. No pasture or rangeland applications are subject to the WPS unless you're actually going to harvest that forage, the hay, or other material forage that's growing on that land, and that makes it an agricultural establishment when we do that. Any ag use pesticides that are used to protect structures, livestock, or weeds in non-crop areas are not subject to the WPS. Now, before we move on, I see we have a few questions. I'd like to address those if we can.
Yeah, we have one question. Can you address later the effects, if any, from the recent trial where Monsanto lost the case?
Thanks for bringing that up. I'll address it very quickly right here. It's not necessarily related to the WPS. Nothing changes about the WPS because of that court case. But I can tell you what my understanding is. There's a lot of data surrounding glyphosate, that's the active ingredient in Roundup, and whether or not it potentially causes cancer. And that court case was just last week. I assume it's going to be appealed, so stay tuned for further information about that. But it does not cancel the registration for glyphosate. It does not change anything about the WPS in particular. But I'm glad to know it's on your mind, and I'm glad you spoke up, Edgar. Thank you.
One more. Does the post-harvest exemption apply to berries and nuts?
Yes, it does. So after the berries and nuts are removed from the field, if there are any post-harvest applications in storage, for example, those applications would not be subject to the WPS. But any applications in the field where those trees or where the canes are, where berries come and where berries grow, those would be subject to the WPS. This regulation is really intended to work to protect workers and pesticide handlers that work in production, in the fields. That's where it was intended to focus, and that's where it does focus. Thanks for those questions. I'll stop again in a few minutes, but first I'm going to pick up some questions that I've had out in the field when doing these trainings over the past year. Someone has asked, does WPS apply when pesticides are used on a golf course? Typically, no, but there is an exception. Because this is not an agricultural operation, the WPS doesn't apply. However, some golf courses have something they like to call a 19th green, or an area off to the side somewhere where their guests don't necessarily go, where they're growing sod. And that sod may be used to replace sod on the greens that's damaged by something or another. It might be a disease or a divot or something like that. That 19th green where they're growing sod, they're growing agricultural plants there, if they apply pesticides in that space, that is subject to the WPS. And that's because if they didn't grow their own sod for replacement purposes, they would be buying it from a sod farm, and the sod farm is subject to the WPS. So it would be a loophole, but it was closed by this interpretation. Let's look at another question I've had out there in the world. Does the WPS apply to seasonal conservation crews that work on invasive weed control? You can picture in this space that there might be some need to control invasive weeds that could really mess up this natural area. So there are conservation crews that go out all over Oregon and around the nation to control invasive weeds, and their work is not subject to the WPS unless they're working on an agricultural establishment where agricultural plants will be harvested. So that's a no. What about this one? Does WPS apply when pesticides are used on rangeland? Hopefully you remember from just a few minutes ago I mentioned that rangeland is exempt unless they're planning to actually harvest any of those agricultural plants. It doesn't count if you're actually harvesting with livestock that are going to, chew down all of that grass. That's not harvesting. That's grazing, and it's an exempt area. What about this one? We're manufacturing treated seed. Does the WPS apply to us? So there are facilities around the country and several in Oregon where they treat seeds. So the seeds are coming from an agricultural establishment. They go into a great big vat where they're treated with different compounds that protect it while it's in the soil so it doesn't get eaten before it has a chance to germinate. No. If you're in one of those facilities that is not an agricultural establishment, you're not growing any plants on that site, then it does not apply to you. If your seed treatment facility is on an agricultural establishment where you're growing plants, it might get a little murkier there, and I encourage you to talk to your local state WPS contacts, and we're going to give you contact information for those here at the end of the webinar. All right, moving forward, we need to understand very well the definition of who is a worker and who is a pesticide handler. It's okay if you don't use those same words on your property. Some people say, we call them all workers, or we call them something else. That's fine, but the WPS has these specific definitions. So for those of you on the webinar, let's get to know these definitions well. A worker is any person, including a self-employed person, who's employed, that means they get paid something of value, and perform activities that are directly relating to the production of agricultural plants on an agricultural establishment. So a person is a worker under the WPS if they work in areas that were treated with a WPS labeled pesticide within the last 30 days, or where a restricted entry interval was in effect in the last 30 days. The restricted entry interval, or REI as it's often called, is the amount of time after application when workers are prohibited from entering that space. Sometimes it's something like 4 hours, it can be up to 72 hours, but it gives that product time to break down to a lower concentration before workers enter those spaces. So I live in Albany, work in Albany, and I talk to a lot of folks about hay issues. Right now is the season. They're out there harvesting the hay and baling it, but it's been more than 2 months since there was a pesticide application in those fields. So all the workers that are coming in to help with baling hay are not subject to the WPS because of that second bullet. It's been more than 30 days since the last application. So those hay growers don't have to worry about the WPS protections because the potential for exposure is much, much lower after all that time has passed. Pesticides, when they're applied, they break down when exposed to the air, the sunlight, water. They can be carried away from the site. A lot of things are acting on them and breaking them down during those first 30 days, especially after an application. So which activities are directly related to the production of agricultural plants? These kind of activities. I brought this picture in because you can picture with this fellow working down there with the plants, he's getting his hands right in there. With these activities like harvesting and thinning and hand weeding and scouting, those kind of activities really present an opportunity for the workers to be exposed to the residues on the foliage or on the soil or in the irrigation water. They have the potential for that exposure. So this is a worker of someone who's not handling pesticides, but they're handling treated foliage. They're handling treated things as they're doing these activities that are directly related to production. You might have other people that come onto the property that work in areas that were treated in the last 30 days, but they're not doing activities that are directly related to the plant's production. Things like if you have people coming on site to deliver materials to the establishment, they're not workers under the WPS. Buying pesticides or application equipment, as long as those pesticide containers are never opened and they're moving them around, they would not be subject to the regulation. I'm not going to read the rest of them to you. You kind of get the idea. Carrying or moving containers that have never been opened, post-harvest handling of products, and there's one more set I'll show you as well. Performing pest control activities in the offices or buildings that are not used for production. That's not what the WPS is intended to protect. Government-sponsored pest control campaigns. So if there's an effort in your area to control gypsy moths or some other invasive insect and there might be overhead applications taking place, those are not subject to the WPS. If you have beekeepers that are coming on the property to do those activities, they're not working on the plants. They're not touching those plants. So they're not subject to the WPS. Also, we've been asked the question about firefighting activities. Those are not subject to the WPS unless the fires are planned as part of the agricultural production cycle. If they are planned burns, controlled burns that are planned, then that is an activity that's directly related to ag plants. So the folks that are working that fire would have to be trained as workers, or you'd have to wait 30 days or more after the last application to bring those folks in to do the controlled burn. I want to stop right there and draw your attention to another one of the links that we put up earlier. It's called Who Needs to Be Trained or What Training is Needed, I think. And Tyla's going to go ahead and put that link up for you. There it is in the bottom right. Is WPS training needed? If you click on that link, it'll take you to a really handy document, I think, that employers can use to say, so I've got a person doing this kind of activity. Is that person a worker, a handler, or neither? That's a really handy piece. With that, I'll go into the definition of a handler. It seems pretty obvious, right? A pesticide handler is someone who handles pesticides, but it's not quite that obvious. It's actually a broader definition. Obviously, someone who mixes, loads, helps to apply, or applies pesticides is a pesticide handler. But also, they wrapped into this definition other folks who have the opportunity to be exposed not just to the spray, but to the concentrate. If you're disposing of pesticides, handling open containers, acting as a flagger, or cleaning and adjusting, handling, or repairing equipment that may have pesticide residues. Each of those activities can present the opportunity for a concentrated dribble of the pesticide to end up on the skin, or perhaps to have something that gets on the face or in the mouth. It requires additional training and awareness, just so those handlers, those employees can protect themselves and their families from the effects of pesticide exposure. This is slide 1 of 2 on the definition for handlers. The second slide basically lists folks that go into treated spaces before they're supposed to. So if you have folks who enter an enclosed space like a greenhouse or something like that, or a mushroom house, after it was treated and before the ventilation criteria have been met, that's ventilation criteria that would be listed on the label, that person should be trained as a handler. Entering a treated area outdoors after application of a soil fumigant and before aeration, that person should be trained as a handler. And likewise, performing tasks as a crop advisor during an application or an REI. That's a restricted entry interval. So those folks have opportunity for more exposure than your everyday worker, and they need more training and more protection as handlers. At this moment, I'd like to stop and see if there are any questions about the definitions of worker or handler. At this time, I hope you're thinking about the employees on your establishment, who you might need to train as a worker, who you might need to train as a handler. The rest of the presentation really requires you to know who are these folks. So if you have any questions, do speak up. I don't see any immediately, but I'll wait just one moment.
What word, if you know, is being used in Spanish for handler?
You know, I don't know that answer, but I think there's someone on the webinar who does know. Daniela, if you're able to weigh in on the chat box and let us know. Daniela Wenger's a public health student that's been interning with our program this year, and she speaks Spanish. She's been helping with our Spanish training sessions. It looks like she's typing in response. What's the word for handler in Spanish? Okay. Handler in Spanish, I'm not going to try to say it. Maybe I'll try. Manipuladores. Okay, there you go. Thank you for the question, Edgar, and thank you for the answer, Danielle. Let's move on. The principles of the worker protection standard are broken into three chunks. Most of them are rules intended to inform workers and handlers about their risks and how to prevent those risks. Some of the rules are intended to protect from pesticide exposure, and a few rules are intended to help in the case of an unintended exposure. Moving forward, let's look at those rules intended to inform. We're going to go through each of these in detail. First, let's talk about something that happened in the early 2000s, closer to 2007, that really led to a lot of the changes that we're seeing in the updated WPS. There was a very unfortunate incident in Florida with the strawberry harvesting teams, where 3 women actually gave birth to babies with birth defects that were very similar and attributable perhaps to the pesticide exposures they experienced when they were in the fields harvesting strawberries. Now, the workers said they didn't know that they would be exposed to levels of pesticides that could impact their pregnancies, and they didn't know that pesticide exposure could impact their pregnancies. So a lot of this training, the new training requirements are intended to make sure that never happens again, that people can make informed decisions about where they're going to work and what exposures they will tolerate when they're going to give birth. So you'll notice this annual training, the updates to pesticide safety training, it used to be 12 training points for workers and about 18 for handlers. That just about doubled. And all those new training points have an emphasis on hazards to pregnant women and small children. Making sure folks know that pregnant women and small children are more sensitive to the effects of pesticides than vigorous adults. Part of that is because of their small bodies, and the dose makes the poison. A smaller dose, the same dose for an adult and a child is much more dangerous for the child. This training about pesticide safety topics used to be required every 5 years. Now it's required every year, every 12 months. So if you were to train your workers and handlers every January, for example, it's okay if 1 year you train them on the 5th and the next year you train them on the 8th. You won't be in violation necessarily for 3 days as long as you train them every 12 months. You should be good to go, but it's required annual training. And there's no grace period anymore. With the older WPS, you had 5 days to get someone trained, and now you have to get them trained before they begin working in treated areas, before they begin any handling tasks. And those are all the tasks that we described in those 2 slides for what makes a handler. No grace period, annual training, and there's more. I'll address this question first about I've had this question many times. Can I do my WPS training for my employees remotely, maybe using the computer somehow? And the answer is yes. That is allowed by the US EPA, but the trainer has certain qualifications we're going to cover in the next slide. And I will caution that I wouldn't advise to do remote training unless you have a facilitator in the room with the trainees who can help wrangle, answer questions, ensure that folks are paying attention to the training content and not zoning out and looking at their phones and that kind of thing. The second question on this slide, are there any prepared presentations that I can use that would make it easier? Of course, wouldn't have asked the question if the answer was no. Here's how you can find those. I'm going to reference again the pesticideresources.org. If you click on this WPS Compliance Assistance Library, you'll come to this page. This is a great homepage for your WPS questions. You'll notice a great big link in blue down at the bottom for training materials. If you click there, you'll see that there's a menu of choices, training materials for workers, for handlers, for trainers, and for agricultural employers. So the EPA has to approve all of the training materials now, and we have a close relationship with EPA. They let us know when new things are approved if the person who wrote that material wants it to be available for free to everyone online, then we'll put it in this list. Otherwise, there are some training materials that folks would rather keep inside their companies. That's fine too, but they still have to be EPA approved. Moving on, a little bit more about training, and then I'll stop and answer some questions. In order to deliver the annual training, the trainer has to be qualified in one of three ways. They could either be a certified applicator, that means someone who has any kind of pesticide applicator license that is current. It could be in Oregon, we have private applicator licenses, public, and commercial. Any of those would work, any category. In order to get that license, you've already taken a test that shows your knowledge about pesticide safety and labeling, and that makes you more capable of answering questions for the workers and handlers during that training event. If your operation doesn't have any certified applicators, then you could send someone to an EPA-approved Train the Trainer program. That's what I did to get qualified. I had to go down to California to get it, but there is an online version of the Train the Trainer program coming out from PERC at pesticideresources.org in the next month. It will be complete and ready, and if you'd like to be notified when that training is available, please sign up for email updates with the directions I gave at the beginning of the webinar. The third way to be qualified is to be designated by the state or tribe or by EPA. That's pretty rare. My understanding is that pretty much only happens for employees of the state, the tribe, or of EPA. But it is something that you can seek out if you think you're already qualified and don't want to meet one of these other two criteria. For the annual training we're talking about, all those training materials have to be EPA approved. That is in effect right now. The trainer has to be present throughout the training. There's several videos that are very popular for WPS training, but that doesn't mean you can pop in the video and walk away. You have to stay present and answer questions. A couple times that I've shown the video, usually I do training with a PowerPoint presentation, but there are videos, like one time I lost my voice practically and showed the video. I still stopped that video periodically to ask questions, challenge questions, keep the learners engaged, and let them know that I was going to be asking them questions about the content. So that's a good way to make sure that folks are listening. And I'll remind you as well, I'm in touch often with Oregon OSHA. That's the agency in Oregon that will enforce the worker protection standard. Their method of making sure this training has occurred properly is to ask the workers and handlers things that they should know if they were paying attention to the video or the training. If they don't know those things, then a violation could occur. So it's not just delivering the training that's the rule. It's making sure that information actually makes it into the brains of the people we're trying to protect. With that, I think I'll hold up and see if there's any questions that I should answer.
Yeah, we have one. What was the website again for the online trainer?
Okay, what you'll do is go to pesticideresources.org and sign up for email updates. Right in that top banner at pesticideresources.org, there's a note that says email updates where you can sign up. Right now, the online Train the Trainer course is not yet posted, but it's done, and we're just about ready to release it. So for those of you watching the recorded webinar, if you go to pesticideresources.org and click on the link on the homepage that says Materials for Training Trainers, That's where you'll find it in the long run. But right now, you'll need to sign up for email updates, and you'll get an email when it comes out. What else?
Will we have access to this PowerPoint?
If you would like it, absolutely. We are planning to post the recording of this webinar at emt.oregonstate.edu/PSEP. That stands for Pesticide Safety Education Program. It'll be posted there and on our YouTube channel, but we can also post the PowerPoint presentation. I'm happy to share it with anyone. So this is a presentation I often use for employers, as I'm doing today, and it's not EPA approved. Remember, it doesn't have to be EPA approved unless it's the official annual training for workers or handlers. What else can I answer for you?
Are there requirements for training logs?
Yes, there are actually. And again, I'll refer back to pesticideresources.org. Go to the WPS link. And along that left-hand column, you'll see a whole bunch of requirement guides. Go to the requirement guide called Training. And in that document, you'll see that there's a kind of a question answer format. What are the record keeping requirements for annual training? All listed right there. There's no official training record or card that's being used in Oregon or by EPA. So as the trainer, you can make up any kind of training record you like as long as it has all those required elements. It includes things like the date of the training, the names of the trainer and the trainees, signatures, the EPA approval number for the materials that were used, and the trainer's qualification to train. So when I fill out one of those, I always say that, my name is Casey Buell as the trainer, and I'm qualified to train because I went to a EPA-approved train-the-trainer course, and I provide the date of that training in California. Some people would use their license number and just give their private, commercial, or public applicator license number as their qualification to train. You get the idea. Are there some templates for these trainings? Not yet. We're working on a publication to have a whole bunch of choices for you folks, but in the meantime, you can make up any old thing you like in Word or some other program and use that as your training record. But it is required to keep training records for 2 years after an employee has been working on your establishment. What else?
I took an online Train the Trainer through Iowa State University that claims it was an EPA approved. Is
Mhm.
that approved?
It certainly is. I'm aware of that Iowa State training. It's my understanding that only prepares you to train workers, not handlers. And it does have all the expanded content, so that still meets the requirements, yes. But only for workers, not for training handlers.
Excellent. We have one more coming in from the looks of it. I will note I'm putting up our website again. It's emt.oregonstate.edu/capital P, capital S, capital E, capital P. That's PSEP.
Okay, thanks for doing that. I think I'll move on for now, and we'll catch up with those additional trainings as needed, additional questions. How about this for training materials? I've had this question. I found some great prices on WPS videos, but I don't know if they're the newest version or if they've been approved by EPA. I'm going to go back in the presentation to a slide. Here we go. When we looked at training materials, this is how you can tell. Tyler, can they see my cursor moving around? Okay, so in the upper right corner of this page, in bold, it says approval number EPA WPS Train the Trainer. That's what TTT stands for. W/H means workers and handlers. This is what an EPA approval number looks like, and that's how you can tell. So if you were to look online, I understand there's other kits available from other vendors, safety vendors around the country. Look for this EPA approval number. It'll be in this format. Starting in December of this year, all training materials have to be completely updated with that new training content. But already, as of today, in August of 2018, all materials have to be EPA approved. So we have this kind of weird 6-month period where you can use older materials that were EPA approved that are not necessarily all the way updated, but starting in December of 2018, they'll have to be completely expanded to include the 23 training points for workers and 36 for handlers. That's how you can tell. All right, I'm moving forward again. Does EPA have a list of approved materials online? Yeah, it's right here at pesticideresources.org. I know it sounds like I'm really self-promoting this program, but it's the program nationally that EPA is using to get the word out about all the materials that are available for folks to use on a nationwide basis. We're honored to be able to help in that way. What about this? Why do I have to include WPS training materials if I already have a great training plan? Well, I applaud your efforts to have a great training plan, but the law is the law, and it does include that we have to cover those 23 training points for workers and 36 for handlers, and those materials have to be EPA approved. So you're welcome to write up your own training program, sort of work it into the program that you already have and cover those training points, but then you would have to submit that training program to EPA for approval. And there are instructions on the EPA website about how to do that, but I'll give you a warning, it can take months to get that done because there's only so many folks at EPA working on that project. How about this? How about if can't I just refer to the new poster, the new WPS poster during my training and write that down as my EPA approved material? No, you absolutely can't because the poster does not include all 23 training points for workers and 36 training points for handlers. Um, so that's not a viable approach. What about this? What if I plan to cover all my WPS points during my training and I don't see any of those EPA approved training materials that fit in my training curriculum? Um, well, we'll have to fit them in or add them on, or you can get your training approved by EPA for use within your company and get your own EPA approval number. But like I said previously, that can take a few months to get done, and it's very often there's a back and forth with EPA to make sure that they're covering those points in enough detail. But you can use the videos as a great example of the level of depth and detail the EPA will approve. Moving forward, in addition to the annual training we've been talking about, there are pieces of establishment-specific information that have to be given to workers and handlers when they go to a new site. This is particularly important for migrant workers or seasonal workers that might go from farm to farm to farm. So maybe they got trained at the first farm they worked at this summer and they're bringing with them their training record. That's great. You don't have to show them the video again. You don't have to train them again on your site. You need to keep a copy of that training record in your files for 2 years and then make sure that they know where you keep the central posting area on your property and where they can wash their hands. Where can they find the decontamination facilities or supplies to wash their hands? In the training materials, I keep mentioning those 23 training points for workers. It seems like about half of them have to do with hand washing. That's one of the biggest things that they can do to protect themselves and reduce the residue that gets in the mouth or on the clothing and gets brought home. So if we're going to train them to wash their hands all the time, they need to be able to wash their hands on your facility. One of the best ideas I've heard for this is many agricultural establishments will have a requirement for visitors or new employees or even labor contractors to check in at the office. Put something on that clipboard where folks sign in that says where you keep your central posting area and where the hand washing supplies are on your establishment. And in that way, you've got a document actually that says here's where they signed in and the information was right here. That's a great way to do it. All right. Now let's move on to updates to pesticide record keeping. Workers and handlers must be able to obtain information about pesticide applications. That includes the pesticide application record and the safety data sheet. I'll be saying SDS for safety data sheet that occurred when they are or were employed. A worker or handler can also designate a representative in writing to have access to the information. Some employees might be intimidated to ask for the information or not know how to ask. They're welcome to designate a representative, but that they'll still have to sign in writing that they're designating that person to request records on their behalf. Facilities must now keep those pesticide application records and the safety data sheets and the training records for 2 years. That's part of the national federal WPS. So if an employee, even a seasonal employee, maybe somebody was only on your property to do harvesting activities one day, they could come back 18 months later within 2 years and ask for records about the pesticides that were applied to the parcels where they were working within that past 30-day window or where an REI was in effect in the last 30 days. So the record keeping needs to be pretty solid so you can go back and find those records for folks within that 2-year window. In Oregon, there's more specific rules that safety data sheets must be maintained for 30 years. So a filing system, an electronic filing system, or something like that is usually used. I'm going to go into this in more detail. So a central posting area will include one, hazard information. That is basically the safety data sheet for each pesticide that's been used on the establishment in the last 30 days or where an REI was in effect in the last 30 days. Um, I'll stop there for a second. Really, you want me to post all the safety data sheets for the whole establishment up on a bulletin board? That's a lot. Maybe some of them, maybe some ag establishments have dozens of products happening at different locations around different greenhouses or in forest areas. There are a number of ways to do this. And really, as the establishment operator, you'll have to get creative about how to make this work for you. Maybe it means posting a binder, making something available in that way, or loading the SDSs onto a tablet that you're able to mount somewhere nearby and have electric access. But in addition, we also have to have the pesticide application information. That's number 2 that you see identified on this slide. Usually it looks like this in a table format. Each column would be things like the date of application, the product that was applied, its EPA registration number and active ingredients, the description of the location where it was applied. Maybe it's a field name, maybe it's a room in a greenhouse, maybe it's a plot in forested areas, and it also includes the REI. In my experience talking with growers, you're already keeping track of pesticide applications. You have some kind of record keeping system that meets requirements under other laws. For commercial applicators have to keep track of those applications, and private applicators have to keep track of restricted use pesticides. My advice is to take a look at your existing record and make sure that it has a column for the REI duration. The amount of time that people have to stay out, and add that column if it's missing, and you'll probably be up to snuff on this. So accessible in a central posting area, you need to have the SDSs and the application records, and the third piece is pesticide safety information. Most of the time, this is done with a poster like the ones that you see on the right part of this slide. The older WPS poster is behind the newer WPS poster. The poster is really full of safety information tips. It helps workers recognize that they might be exposed to pesticide residues, not just on the treated foliage, but also on the soil, in the air, in the water, on PPE, on vehicles. It gives them information about how to protect themselves on a regular basis. Promoting those hand washing behaviors and that kind of thing. So 1, 2, 3, the SDSs, the application records, and the pesticide safety information. I'll answer a couple questions about this and then go to the questions in the webinar. The poster is available at pesticideresources.org. You can actually print your own copies off the website. That's fine. You can buy laminated copies from the website. They'll have them shipped to you within a week. We have large copies and small copies in English and Spanish. There's more languages coming very soon. We've already had it translated into Mandarin, Haitian Creole, Russian, Vietnamese, and one more that I can't recall at this time. But this safety information, this poster or something like it, needs to be posted at your central location, at all permanent decontamination sites. That would mean places like sinks where folks are washing up on a regular basis, or maybe you have an outbuilding where there's hand washing supplies at one of the far-flung places on your property, and at any decontamination site that serves 11 or more workers or handlers. So I'm picturing in that scenario, maybe you have labor contracted folks working in an area to harvest blueberries, and you have an area with a porta potty and some hand washing supplies. You're going to need a version of this poster to be posted there if it's serving 11 or more workers. So for many of the ag employers I've talked to about this, they end up getting 1 or 2 large posters, depending on the number of central posting locations they have, and then they might get 5 or 6 of the smaller posters so they can make sure they're posted up at those permanent decontamination sites, at the sinks, and at those mobile units that serve 11 or more workers. One question I've had out in the world, do I have to use the pesticide safety poster that's on the PERC website, or can I design my own? You can certainly design your own if you like. There's a list in the law, it's in the Code of Federal Regulations, about what that poster needs to include. It's a very specific list, so you can make up your own poster if you'd like. If you change it, if you do something different to it, does it have to get EPA approved? No. The poster does not have to be EPA approved, but it needs to have a space on it where there's contact information for the nearest medical facility that's capable of providing emergency care and for the regulators in your state so that workers or handlers can report a violation of the WPS if they choose to do so. After 30 days, those records that are posted in an accessible location can go into storage for the rest of their 2 years, but the pesticide safety poster would stay right there. All right. The safety data sheets need to be in a location accessible to workers and handlers. I've had a lot of questions about this. Um, Here's one way to do it is to post something at your central posting location with a binder that can stay right there. It depends on if your central location is inside away from the weather or if it's outside. May take some creativity on your part, but the safety data sheet is the piece of information that can tell workers and handlers this chemical has the potential to affect pregnancy or cause birth defects or cause long-term respiratory illness or cancer. That's one of the key pieces of information that we want to make sure people have so they can choose wisely when they're deciding, am I really going to wear my gloves all the time? Am I really going to wash my hands before and after I go to the bathroom for the rest of my life? I hope so, because there's some serious health effects that could result otherwise. The question on this slide is digital storage okay? Yes, digital storage is all right if all of the workers and handlers have access to it and know how to use that digital device without asking for permission or help. As soon as it becomes intimidating to use technology, that information is no longer accessible to the individuals. So think about how to make it accessible to everyone. And you might say, I've talked to some growers who said, look, I give smartphones to all my employees so I can, push information out to everyone at the same time. Great. If they have the devices and know how to use them, digital storage is going to work really well for that grower, but it may not work for every grower. Someone else has asked, what if my operation has many separate locations but one central posting site? That works as long as the workers and handlers have access to the central posting location. Maybe they have to get in a truck and drive a few miles back to the central, main location or the home piece, as some people call it. But if they can do that anytime they need to access that information, then it is accessible. It doesn't have to be on the same physical location as long as they have access. If those workers and handlers are not allowed to take the company truck and go to the home piece or to the main location, then it's no longer accessible. See what I'm getting at? You can keep the central posting location and all the SDSs in the office, but only if the office is open all the same hours that workers and handlers work. If they're working at 6 a.m. and the office is not open until 8 a.m., it's not accessible. I hope that's building a picture for you. So with that, I think we're going to move on to another topic. So before we move on to that other topic, I'll stop and see if there's any questions I can answer.
Yes, we have a couple of them. A popular question I know we get asked all the time. I just updated our SCS manuals to reflect the 2012 updates. Do we also need to have them available in Spanish?
No, the regulation does not require that. But if they would like to look at those, I mean, that's one of the reasons that they might designate a representative to ask on their behalf. If a Spanish-speaking worker wanted access to those records, they might ask an English-speaking person to access the records and explain it to them. The rule does not require that the information be available in that person's spoken language, unfortunately.
Excellent. And can you say again where they can get the WPS posters?
Yes, absolutely. I believe it's on one of these slides. Here it is, pesticideresources.org/WPS/CP, and that's for central posting.html. And at that site, you can either print your own copies, buy laminated copies, do whatever you like. A lot of people like to download the PDF files and then send them to a local printer where they can, shop around and get the best price. We have a national vendor who will do it for you and send the copies to you. I think they're pretty competitive on pricing, but the market will decide where you want those printed.
And staying on the topic of the posters, just a clarification. For each sink, we need a poster?
If that sink is providing the decontamination supplies for your workers and handlers, yes.
Okay. Another question. The required Bully Ag poster includes this information.
To my knowledge, it does not include all of the information on this new poster. Uh, the most recent version I've seen of the Bowley poster still had that old one. Um, this pinkish one, pink and orange up in the upper right-hand corner. If that's what you see, that one's out of date. So the newer poster is required. It has more information on it than the old poster did, and it has more contact information than the old poster did. So it is something where there could be a potential violation if you're relying on the Bowley poster and not getting the new updated WPS poster.
Excellent. And last one isn't necessarily a question, but Gimplers has a new pesticide record keeping form available that includes WPS, just a promotional piece.
Well, that's good to know. And I see that link down there in the questions. So those of you who'd like to click on that and go see what they've got to offer, feel free.
And we'll post that at the end for everyone watching it after the recording to have that available as well.
Okay. Thanks for doing that. And thanks everybody for your questions. Let's move on to talking about updates for pesticide application posting. I hope this sign looks familiar to everyone. This is the sign that's required for WPS. Now, it is still true that you would look at the pesticide label, and if the label says you have to post or post warning signs, then the label wins. You have to post no matter what if the label says you have to post. But if the label is silent and doesn't say anything about posting warning signs, the new WPS says you have to post and put up this warning sign for outdoor applications if the REI, the restricted entry interval, is greater than 48 hours. Not equal to, but greater than. So if you're applying a product that has a 48-hour REI and the label doesn't say anything about posting warning signs, you don't have to post. But if that REI instead is 72 hours, you do. For enclosed space production, the same kind of rule applies. If the label says you have to post that greenhouse room or that hoop house, then you have to post. The label wins. But if the label is silent, then you have to post that space for any application with an REI greater than 4 hours. So where should I post the signs? Let's answer that question first. It depends on the parcel you're treating, and there's a lot of judgment involved. Post at any obvious entrance point to the parcel. If there's a path or a road going through that parcel, then you would post at a place where someone coming down the path or road would see the sign and know that they shouldn't enter. Sometimes it might be a block within lots of blocks and there's no obvious entrance. In that case, you might post all 4 sides or all 4 corners. If the parcel is big enough, you might have to post more than 4 signs around the edges to ensure that folks are notified that they shouldn't be entering that treated space during the REIs, restricted entry intervals. And when should those signs come down? Within 72 hours of the end of the REI, so you basically have 3 days grace period to get that sign down, but there's a hard and fast rule about this too, before workers enter. That's when you have to take the signs down. At no time can an ag employer instruct their workers to go into a space where this sign is posted. We don't want workers to start ignoring the signs. That's what happened between 94 and 2014. The signs became kind of meaningless in some places where they were left up too much, too often, and workers began to ignore them. So we need to make sure that sign is meaningful and take it down before workers enter those areas. Next, what about those indoor applications? Where should I post the signs? Well, in this scenario, let's say that there is only an application to this, one little spot of the bed that these 2 gentlemen are looking at. They would actually have to post the whole room, both entrances to this hoop house. They would have to post that sign. If they posted the signs right on the treated bits, it's possible that there'd be people who, are working very, very close by and don't notice it and come in contact with that treated foliage or treat it the same. So for a greenhouse space, it's the whole room. And I recognize that's a really big issue. Some greenhouse spaces here in Oregon and around the country are acres of indoor production space. If it's all one room, The REI applies to the entire room, even if you only make an application to one bench in that greenhouse. The EPA has weighed in on this. There are questions and answers from the EPA available on their site for WPS. And essentially, they're saying you can keep that REI just to the one bench if you're able to create barriers that keep people from coming in contact with the treated foliage on that bench. So there's one guy who came up with a plan with shower curtains that he put, all the way around the bench, and they went up high enough that nobody could see over it, and then he put another shower curtain across the top. Yeah, if you can build some kind of structure like that and post that and keep people out of that bench, sure, but otherwise, the REI would apply to the whole room when making indoor applications. All right. I know there may be some questions about that, but for now, I'll move on. In the interest of time, can't believe we're already an hour in. If you have your PPE, the personal protective equipment, cleaned by an external vendor, maybe you have it all collected at the end of the day and sent off to a laundry service overnight, we need to notify those laundry services that the clothing may be contaminated with pesticides and procedures, give them procedures for handling contaminated clothing and personal hygiene practices and decontamination procedures. Um, Thank goodness for Oregon OSHA because they developed just such a little card that you can actually download from their website. You can order it from them. They have copies available that are magnets, really handy, so that they could go right up onto a washing machine and remind people as they're doing laundry that they should be using these practices and washing their hands after contact with contaminated clothing. Similarly, if you have equipment that may be contaminated with pesticide residues and the equipment is going off-site for service, this mechanic pictured in the picture might be exposed to pesticide residue, so we need to make sure that they know the equipment may be contaminated, procedures for handling the pesticide application equipment, and those personal hygiene practices that reduce the risk. Unfortunately, we don't have a nice piece like this one for laundry, but it's in the works. Something that you could send with your work order as the piece of equipment is going off site for maintenance. With that, are there any additional questions at this time? No, I'm getting a no. Then we'll move on into those provisions of the worker protection standard intended to protect. The first one's pretty straightforward. We've got a minimum age now. For pesticide handlers, for doing any of those activities that we mentioned at the beginning that are handler activities, including disposing of pesticides, handling any container that's been opened, working on equipment. Those individuals have to be 18 years old now, and it's the ag employer's responsibility to ensure that. That's also a minimum age for early entry workers, those folks who have to go into a space during the REI. Members of the owner's immediate family are exempt from this age requirement. Next, we're going to talk about the application exclusion zone. The application exclusion zone, that's a weird title. We're calling it the AEZ for short. It's basically this red circle. It's a halo that goes around the application equipment, and it's an area that people need to stay out of. The thickness of this halo, the red spot, could be 0, 25, 100, or in Oregon, 150 feet. So I'll explain that. It's 150 feet for any applications that involve a fine mist, aerial application, air blast applications that require eye protection. Sorry, not eye protection, respiratory protection. 150 feet if respiratory protection is required. It's only 100 feet for those applications with fine mist, aerial applications, or air blast. It's 25 feet if you're using any other application method other than air or air blast, and you can keep your droplet size down to like medium or coarse. Bigger droplets don't drift as far. So if you can keep your droplets bigger and use other application methods besides the air and air blast, it's down to 25 feet. You can get that AEZ, the halo, down to 0 if you apply using any method other than air and air blast. Keep your droplet size large, like medium or coarse size droplet size, and you can look on your nozzle information to see the droplet size for those nozzles. And you keep that nozzle within 12 inches of what you're spraying. That's how you get down to 0, by making an application very close to the spraying medium with large droplets that fall fast. So now that you understand like how we get from 0 to 25 or 100 or 150 feet, I'll break down the difference in responsibilities. This halo might actually extend off the property. So there's two pieces of responsibility here. The employers have to keep workers and other people out of the AEZ on their own property. The applicator must suspend an application whenever someone who's not involved in the application enters the AEZ on or off the property. So they might see somebody who's walking by on a rail trail that's within 25 feet. They would have to suspend that application and wait for the folks to walk by, and then they could continue. This AEZ moves with the application. In this next slide, we're going to see a little video to show you kind of what that means. And I apologize if they don't line up just right, but use your imagination. This airplane travels across the field. The AEZ is the red circle around the application equipment. It leaves behind the treated area. If there's a restricted entry interval for this pesticide, the purple area would be under the REI. No one who's not an early entry worker or protected person could enter that space until the end of the REI. But you'll notice this AEZ, it ceases to exist when the application is over. After the application equipment passes that spot, the AEZ is no longer applicable in that spot. What happens if we've got workers in the field right next door? Let's take a look at that scenario. And just imagine that this airplane is able to stop in midair, suspend. There's workers in the neighboring field. Can you ask the workers to move somewhere else until you're done with the application? Yes, they agreed to move. Fantastic. And we can make that final pass and proceed with caution. Those workers would be allowed to come right back to the edge of their field and do their work as soon as that airplane passes over and finishes that last pass. But they would not be able to enter the purple area under the REI if there was an REI. Now, what about this other scenario where there might be some ornery workers in the neighboring field who don't want to move or refuse to move? There are workers in the neighboring field in the AEZ. They refuse to move. Can you evaluate and ensure these workers won't be contacted through drift? Yes, the wind is blowing away from the workers, and I can ensure that my application will not contact them. In that case, you can proceed. Proceed with caution, even though you have workers in the AEZ or other people in the AEZ. If you can ensure that you will not contact them, either directly or through drift, then you can go right ahead. Now, the question has been asked to me, let's say, for a real aerial application, you can't suspend in midair. You can turn off the nozzles, certainly, but what if I, communicated with my neighbors ahead of time and said, I know you're going to have folks harvesting in the next field over. I'm going to be doing an airplane application. My AEZ is 100 feet on all directions. What do you think? And the neighbor says, we really have to get in there today. We have no choice. We have to do it. Then as an applicator and working with the employer, take a look at the weather patterns, take a look at the site, ensure that you won't contact those workers either directly or through drift. I encourage you to document those efforts. And you would either proceed with the application if you can ensure there would be no drift onto those workers, or wait until another day when those workers won't be within 100 feet of the application area. Before I move on, I want to see if we can answer any questions.
Excellent. We do have quite a few. Does the AEZ apply to passing traffic on a public highway all the same if they're in a vehicle or on foot?
Yes. I took this picture recently with Kimberly in the car where there's an aerial application taking place right up next to I-5, for example. This still applies. His AEZ is 100 feet in all directions. That's the length of about 2.5 school buses. This applicator cannot be sure that my windows are up, that my air intake is off. So we have to treat those travelers on the road like they are, potentially going to get exposed. So he wouldn't be able to turn on his nozzles within 100 feet of the road or where those cars are traveling on the road.
How long after the airplane passes do they need to consider the wind and the direction it's blowing?
Well, certainly an aerial applicator always has to consider the wind when they're making an application and make sure that they're picking the right time of day and the right weather patterns to make sure that material hits the target. To answer your question, how long after the plane passes, if that pesticide did not require respiratory protection, they can re-enter immediately as soon as that plane passes. Like I said, the AEZ, according to the law, travels with the application equipment. As soon as that application equipment is more than 100 feet away or 150 feet with respiratory protection being required, um, then they can come back right away. But if that respiratory protection is required, there's a 15-minute waiting period before folks can re-enter that space that was under the REI. And I'll get to this again. That's in the upcoming slides, so you'll hear it one more time.
Okay, based on the situation scenario you just described with the AEZ and workers in another field, what if the applicator does not stop working and just continues and doesn't ask the workers to leave?
So what if the applicator doesn't stop working? If the applicator actually results in having spray that contacts those workers, it's a violation. Agricultural pesticides, just everyone I've ever seen, the label says, do not apply this product in a way that will contact others, either directly or through drift. Now, this applicator, if you see this happening and the applicator doesn't suspend the application, they just keep doing along, it's possible that they've already suspended and evaluated before they got started. They knew they were going to be close to a trail where there's often bike traffic or something like that, and so they evaluated the wind. They're keeping track of things and making sure to keep that product on target. So the ultimate violation is contacting those people. And if they don't contact those people, then they can hopefully make the case that they evaluated the risk, they looked at the wind patterns, they selected nozzles that reduce the likelihood of drift. Sometimes people will turn off their directional spray when they're close to a road or a trail. There's lots of things they can do to ensure they don't spray people. So that is a possibility.
Okay. Oregon OSHA's new WPS fact says, will the AEZ apply to my neighbor's property or the county road next to my farm? No, the AEZ only applies within the boundaries of the establishment. The agricultural employer is not expected to control people off the establishment. This is a bit confusing based off of the topics we are talking about currently.
Sure. And I understand that sounds like a contradiction, but you'll notice that in their statement, they're focused on the ag employer. The employer is not expected to control people off the establishment. Absolutely. And OSHA only has authority over employers. But I'll back this up and remind you the piece that applies off property does not apply to the employer. It's the applicator who's responsible. So OSHA's publication is totally correct, and it's focused on the employer and the employer's responsibilities. My talk is extending also to the applicator, who's responsible in the moment to make sure, even if the AEZ extends off property and there are people there, that they suspend and evaluate and ensure that they don't spray those people off property. I hope that helps. The OSHA publication must, by law, be focused on the employer and the employer's responsibilities. As an educator, I can go further and tell you the national law applies also to the applicators and could be enforced not by OSHA, but by ODA. Those pieces that fall outside Oregon OSHA jurisdiction can fall within the Oregon Department of Agriculture under the pesticide label. So I want to make sure that you are protected on both fronts.
Very helpful. And last one, employers often ask what to do when employees outside of the AEZ complain of smelling the pesticide. What's your recommendation?
Well, it is a problem to indicate that they're smelling something. It doesn't necessarily mean they're being exposed to the pesticide's active ingredient. It could be something else in the product, like its carrier or its solvent. But it is potentially of concern. It's something to pay attention to. And I hope now that they have access to the information, those workers can look at the SDS, look at the application records, evaluate the risk, and if it causes them, additional concern, they should talk with their employer about it. Having that smell does not necessarily mean there's a harmful exposure taking place, but it is a cause for concern and certainly something to look into further. There's no hard and fast rule here where I'm going to say, yes, worry about it, or no, don't worry about it. It depends on the product. It depends on the individual's risk tolerance. Maybe that individual is pregnant and they really want to reduce their or trying to get pregnant and they're trying to reduce their exposure to all kinds of things. In that case, they might want to avoid exposure not only to the pesticide's active ingredient, but the solvents and anything else. And in that case, maybe there's something that can be worked out where they don't have to work so close to application areas. Okay, is that all the questions for now?
Yep.
All right, let's keep on moving forward. I'm going to skip back over these slides and go to the new stuff. All right, Oregon's AEZ distances. Um, Everything we just talked about is applicable, and Oregon's rules go one step further for those products that require respiratory protection. That could mean N95 particulate respirator. It could mean any other kind of respirator that has a organic vapor cartridge. There's no shelter-in-place option when the label requires respiratory protection. That statement is really in regards to labor housing that can be very close to the application areas. And if there are applications going on in the middle of the night, maybe the people are sleeping in that labor housing. I think Oregon OSHA was very focused on keeping those workers protected the best way possible. And for many applications that don't require respiratory protection, they can shelter in place. And we'll talk about the additional requirements there. But if the product does require respiratory protection, it means that there's a respiratory hazard. There's no shelter in place option. They have to step back 150 feet, and people must wait 15 minutes before re-entering that space that was under the REI. In addition, for this labor housing issue, I've shown a picture here that shows how close that labor housing can be to the vineyard or the orchards or places where people are living in addition to working. The new rules from Oregon OSHA also require for these scenarios that when applications are going to take place and people might be sheltering in place, remember that labor housing might have kids and grandparents that are not in the fields all day, so there are people living there maybe all the time. They need to be advised when those applications are taking place, instructed to keep their doors and windows closed, turn off any air intake devices or mechanisms like that. Ag employers are responsible to provide provisions to protect or store their personal or household items that are not in the structure. For example, we heard during the feedback process that folks might sleep in those buildings, but they do all their living outside, where they have, a camp stove where they prepare their food, maybe clothes hung on a line, toys, all kinds of stuff being outside. So the ag employer now is responsible to provide some kind of mechanism or provision to help them protect or store their personal items so they don't get sprayed by the sprayer going by. And they need to provide a closable storage area for footwear to prevent tracking of pesticide into the structure. This is a really helpful piece because research has shown keeping shoes out of the house is the best way to reduce the amount of pesticide residue in the dust and carpet samples that they've pulled in those research studies. And who spends all their time on the floor? Kids, toddlers, babies, who put their mouth on everything. So if we can keep the amount of pesticide residue lower on the floor, we're protecting kids by doing that. So a closable storage area outside for the boots will keep those boots from coming inside. So those are some of the additional rules for Oregon OSHA. Now, I'm moving on. The employer is responsible to provide and pay for any of the PPE, personal protective equipment, that's required by the pesticide label. They can provide more, but never less. And I want to provide a caveat here. Sometimes a pesticide label says to wear street clothes, essentially, like long sleeve shirt, long sleeve pants, hat, those kind of things. Not the hat, but long sleeve shirt, long pants, shoes, and socks. Those things are that you would normally wear on the street are not considered PPE, and the employer doesn't have to pay for them. But anything in addition, like chemical resistant footwear, an apron, boots, gloves, those kind of materials have to be paid for by the employer and provided. It's also important that the employer ensure that the materials, the PPE, remains clean, in operating condition, and used according to the manufacturer instructions. Do you see that? Used. It's no longer enough to provide the PPE. The employer needs to make sure it is used according to the manufacturer's instructions. Also, the employer is responsible to repair or replace that material as needed. The employer is also responsible to provide handlers a pesticide-free area for storing personal clothing when it's not in use, and for putting on the PPE and taking it off at the end of the task. What they found in those 20 years between 95 and 2015, if they kept PPE in the same place with pesticides, then the PPE was never really clean. And it resulted in a lot of that residue actually going home with the person rather than staying at work. Don't allow that used PPE to be taken home for any reason. Remember, we're trying to protect pregnant women and children from unnecessary exposure during the sensitive times in their development. Next, we're going to talk about updated rules that are meant to protect, including respiratory protection. We're lucky here in Oregon. This is not new for us. We've been doing all of this with respiratory protection for a long time, but several states, especially in the south and in the east part of the country, are just getting used to this whole thing about medical clearance, fit testing, and instructions on use and maintenance. So I'll break it down quickly for you. If a pesticide label requires the handler to use any kind of respirator, including an N95 mask or something like that, the person has to first be medically cleared by a medical professional to wear a respirator. Respirators of every kind make it harder to breathe a little bit. They insert a filter between the breather and the air. So if someone's already experiencing a medical problem or has predisposition to medical problems, that involve breathing, they really shouldn't be doing that activity. The fit test is specific to the person and the respirator. So if a person needs to wear two different kinds of respirators, they're going to have two different fit tests, one for each type of respirator that they use. This is where they actually put it on and make sure it fits. In order to ensure that it fits, they would be put into some kind of, usually kind of a little chamber with either some very smelly stuff like banana oil or smoke, an irritant of some kind. And if they're detecting any of the strong smell or the smoke, then the fit test fails. That's telling them that it's not keeping all of the material out of your lungs. And then further, they need to be instructed on the use and maintenance of that respirator. Both the fit test and the instructions, basically the training on use and maintenance, are required annually. Medical clearance doesn't necessarily have to be repeated annually, but it needs to be repeated every time something major changes about the individual's medical condition. So maybe they get diagnosed with asthma or experience some other big medical change. Maybe they lost a lot of weight or gained a lot of weight. They should probably get that medical clearance again. Now, in Oregon, you're required to have a written respiratory protection program that includes information about how you will select your respirators, how you will get medical evaluations and fit testing and training done, how you will do cleaning and storage and inspections, and a program evaluation piece. This sounds like a lot of work, but luckily Oregon OSHA has actually put together some great templates. If you were to call Oregon OSHA and ask for a copy of this publication called The Air You Breathe, it actually comes with a CD-ROM in the back that has Word files, PDF files, fit testing information, medical clearance forms that you can use. The medical clearance forms are basically long questionnaires that a handler would use and fill out about their medical history. There are several vendors that will take that information online and review their questionnaire and come back with either a medical clearance, a request to be seen in person, or, if they fail the medical clearance, there's that too. So this is a great publication I encourage you to check out, and I believe it is being updated. That's probably not a picture of the newest version, but there is a new version in the works. Now, remember, Oregon OSHA just completed the last of their WPS regulations within the last month, so I think it might still be in progress. I see this one question, is that the new version of The Air You Breathe? I guess I don't know if the new version is available yet, but if it is, we'll put a link to it on the YouTube version of this webinar. All right. Moving forward, equipment safety. It's the employer's responsibility to make sure that pesticide handling equipment is inspected before each day of use and repaired or replaced as needed. Of course, the agricultural employer may delegate that responsibility, but it rests ultimately with the employer. Only allow properly trained and equipped handlers to repair, clean, or adjust any pesticide handling equipment. Remember, this is one of the things that makes you a handler under the definition of pesticide handler. So that means only properly trained and equipped people can do those activities. Moving forward, early entry workers are folks that need to enter a treated space before the end of the REI. Now, when they were building this regulation, EPA would have really liked to say, look, nobody can enter during the REI. That's what it is. That's what it's supposed to be. But there were several comments submitted saying, sometimes a pipe breaks or something happens and we need to get into that space. So we need some kind of provisions for early entry. And so I call this basically the no lollygagging rule. We need to tell those early entry workers about the pesticide application, the specific task to be performed, the amount of time that the worker is allowed to remain in the area, and they must also be provided with the PPE required by the label. So essentially, we're telling those early entry workers, okay, you can go in, but get in and get out, okay? You're only there to fix the pipe, or you're only there to change this or check something, and then we want you to come back out of that treated area. So this is the updated information for early entry workers. Moving forward, there's just a couple rules left to cover, and they are rules intended to help mitigate in case of a potential pesticide exposure. First, decontamination supplies. Supplies for washing up. These supplies have to be provided by the agricultural employer within a quarter mile of workers or handlers where they're doing their work. 1 gallon of water per worker. This is for hand washing, essentially. 3 gallons of water per handler. Sorry, I misspoke earlier. 1 gallon of water per worker, 3 gallons of water per handler or early entry worker. This is measured at the beginning of their work period. They also have to have single-use towels and soap. I should have had a bullet there for soap. And if you have handlers working in that area, the decontamination supplies also have to have a clean set of clothing or coveralls. And that's in case a handler has a major spill on their clothing and they have to take their clothing off. That's part of the training that they're going to receive in their annual training. Hey, if you spill a bunch of stuff on yourself, take those clothes off immediately. So they need something to change into if that happens. And usually what I've seen employers do is just buy one of those one-size-fits-all Tyvek suits and keep that right there with the soap and towels in case something bad happens. And remember, we're going to be coaching these workers and handlers to wash their hands often, so they need to have enough water and soap and single-use towels to do that. Some people have asked, what about hand sanitizer? Can I just provide hand sanitizer? The answer is no. Hand sanitizer does not remove pesticide residues. It actually rubs them into your skin where they can be absorbed even better. So not the best plan for washing off pesticides. When the product label requires eye protection, like goggles, or if the product is under any kind of pressure, maybe you've got a closed system and it's a pressurized system. So if any hose breaks, there's potential for a big exposure to the eye. So these two scenarios require that eye flush water must be immediately available at the mixing and loading site for handler eye flushing, and the applicator who's using a product that requires goggles or some other kind of eye protection must also keep a pint of water immediately accessible. That's tough, but it's oh so important. A product label does not require eye protection unless that product is capable of causing irreversible eye damage. And when that product comes in contact with the eye, it starts to burn through the cornea right away. Time is of the essence. So if they have that pint of water with them, they can start squirting to get the product off the eye while they're making their way up to a quarter mile where the decontamination supplies are located. They might be running for a sink or a hose or however else you're providing water in that space. For those spaces that are more than a quarter mile away from a hose or a sink or any kind of plumbing, you might provide hand washing supplies like this in big jugs with lots of water. And of course, you're going to use a multiplier. I have 10 workers. I need to have 1 gallon per worker for the workday for hand washing, and that means I'm going to make sure to have 10 gallons of water at the beginning of the work period for them at their work site. If they're handlers, maybe you've got a forestry operation with a bunch of folks doing hack and squirt applications, they need to have 3 gallons of water per handler for hand washing measured at the beginning of the work period. That's because handlers might have bigger exposures and have the need for more washing off. Is a hose okay? Is a sink okay? Absolutely. In fact, you don't have to count gallons if you've got access to plumbing and appropriate water. Now, the WPS rule doesn't say that the water has to be potable, but this is what it says. It says it has to be of a quality and temperature that will not cause injury if swallowed. Well, that sounds like potable water to me, but I don't think the EPA has any jurisdiction over drinking water, so they weren't able to say it that way. And it's sort of like a lake, you know, if you went swimming in the lake and swallowed a little bit of water, that's fine, but I still wouldn't call the lake drinking water. So lake water, similarly, would be acceptable as long as there's no algal bloom or something dangerous going on. Lake water would be acceptable for the hand washing water. Um, there's one more piece before I move off of that. Oh, here it is. Um, what about really remote locations? This happens mostly in forestry, where somebody might be more than a quarter mile from the nearest road. And if that's the case, the decontamination supplies have to be provided within a quarter mile or at the nearest vehicular access. Nearest vehicular access. And remember, we want them to wash their hands a lot. So if they're going to have to walk a half mile to wash their hands, it's probably not going to be very effective. So let's try to get the hand washing supplies as close to their work site as possible. All right, moving on. This is the last provision we're going to talk about, emergency assistance. The agriculture employer must provide transportation to a medical facility if there's reason to believe that someone's been experiencing a potential pesticide exposure, and if he or she needs emergency medical treatment within 72 hours of that exposure. This is really vague. It's intentionally vague because there's a lot of room for judgment here. Essentially, if someone thinks they need to see a doctor about their exposure, it's the employer's responsibility to make sure that they have transportation. That does not necessarily imply that the employer has to pay for that medical visit. That's, somebody else's job to determine that. I don't know, but the WPS does not require that they pay for that medical visit. Now, in order to ensure that the person has a ride to medical treatment, the employer could call an ambulance or make sure the employee has a ride to the medical facility with someone else. That's fine, but they have to ensure that that person has transportation. And if no other mechanism, they must provide that transportation. In addition, they need to provide information to the treating medical personnel, including the SDS sheets for any pesticides that might have been involved in the exposure, the application information, that's the record essentially of the application that has start and stop times, the REI, the pesticide product information, its EPA registration number, all of that. And a third piece, medical personnel really asked for this. They wanted more than just the SDS in the record. They wanted some of the circumstances surrounding exposure. That can really make the difference when making a diagnosis of being able to tell, did the person actually have a big exposure, or were they just touching treated foliage 2 weeks after the application? For how long? Was it 15 minutes or was it all day? Those kind of circumstances can really be helpful to the treating personnel. So the employer is now responsible to provide all three of these pieces of information to the treating medical personnel in the case of a pesticide exposure. With that, those were the rules on the worker protection standard intended to inform and protect and mitigate against pesticide exposures. I'd like to take additional questions that you have at this time. While you're writing some additional questions in the chat box, I want to show off two more pieces that I think you might be interested in at the pesticideresources.org website. This index called Just for You has a great homepage for each type of role an individual in the worker protection standard. There's great resources for workers, for handlers, for employers, for commercial pesticide handler employers. Those are basically like custom applicators or aerial application companies. Any company that does pesticide applications for hire on other people's property is considered a commercial pesticide handler employer. And there's great resources and FAQs for each of the labor types here. If you do use labor contractors, I encourage you to check out the information for ag employers. There's a great FAQ there. It's called how to comply with the WPS when working with labor contractors. Fantastic. And likewise, we also have a set of guides that go piece by piece through each of the different requirements of the worker protection standard, protections for workers, handlers. There's a whole piece about the application exclusion zone, family exemption. You get the idea. So if you just have a follow-up question after this event, you're welcome, of course, to reach out to me and to others at Oregon OSHA or at the SAFE Corporation. But I think you'll find most of the answers you need right here in these guides. And if not, I sure hope you let us know. So with that, I want to show my contact information. I'm Casey Buell at Oregon State University. At EPA Region 10, there's a great WPS contact named Derek Terada. And at Oregon OSHA, the most knowledgeable person I know on the WPS is Garnett Cook, and there's her email address as well. I'm going to back it up to this question slide and see what questions have been coming in.
Excellent, Casey. We have one that's backing up to the respirator section. You mentioned about the N95s, and the question is, do N95 dust masks require medical clearance? I thought they were exempt.
It's my understanding they do require medical clearance.
Excellent. And what do you expect to be the main challenges for employers or violations with regards to the WPS changes?
Well, if history is any indicator, some of the most common violations that they were finding in the last 20 years were violations related to record keeping, central posting requirements. Training has actually been pretty solid. I think when people think about WPS, they think it's about the training, that you have to provide this training to new employees, and that's all the WPS is. But the central posting requirements and record keeping are very important pieces. The respirator stuff is really been the case in Oregon for a long time, so I don't anticipate, and that's the same requirements as you would have in other industries that require respirators. So not as many challenges there. But just being aware of the posting requirements, the record keeping requirements, and setting up a system that works for your facility, I think that will be the biggest challenge. I'm glad to hear that there is a record keeping piece available from Gemplers now. And actually, Kimberly and I are working on another one that's specific to Oregon that will have sample templates, and other information for ag employers to implement the rule.
Excellent. Another question, are there any changes for the choline esterase monitoring?
So for those of you not familiar with what that is, um, for those growers that use organophosphate pesticides or carbamate insecticides, uh, and I think this is a rule in Washington State and in California, but not in the state of Oregon, they're required to have those applicators have their cholinesterase monitored. Basically, they get a test before they're exposed to the pesticide, and then if there's an accident or there are health effects, they can get tested after exposure to the pesticide and see if their cholinesterase levels have been decreased by the exposure. And that's an indicator that they've been getting that pesticide in the body and it's having an effect. The changes to WPS have not changed anything about that protocol in Washington or in California or Oregon.
Excellent. That's all the questions we have at the moment. Any
Okay.
additional thoughts?
I'm honored that so many people have stuck with it an hour and a half into the session, and I recognize it's a complex rule, and that's why there's so many great publications available, frequently asked questions, resources. Rely on your resources, ask questions. I want to make sure that you know also Oregon OSHA will do a consultation with your facility if you like, if you ask them to. The consultation side is very different and completely separate from the enforcement side. So if you get a consultation, they'll actually help you make sure that you're in compliance before enforcement ever becomes an issue. So I encourage you, if you think, okay, I think I've got it right, have Oregon OSHA come out and make sure that you haven't missed something, and then you'll be good to go.
Excellent. Well, we do have one more question regarding that N95, just for clarification. If it is optional and not required and provided by employer for employees who choose to wear, I thought there was no medical training needed. Is that correct, or has it changed?
Well, the WPS requirement only applies when the pesticide label requires the use of that N95. So if they're wearing it because they choose to wear it, not because it's required by the pesticide label, the WPS would not kick in and it would not apply. However, I think I would ask Oregon OSHA that question about allowing them to wear a respirator on your facility without being medically cleared. I'm not sure that's allowed under other rules, but the WPS only applies when the pesticide label requires them to wear that respiratory protection. It can be dangerous for somebody to wear a respirator, even an N95, that impedes their breathing if they already have something going on. There could be liability issues there, perhaps, but that is outside my area of expertise.
Excellent. Thank you for that clarification.
Absolutely. Can we go back to the first slide without going all the way back through? And actually, the second slide is the one I want.
There was a clarification someone posted under the questions section saying, I think they have some more information specifically on the N95 in OSHA's resources, the Breathe Right publication, and we can provide that as a resource
Okay.
link after this.
It looks like they put it in the question as well, so that's great. And we will be happy to share that link. And let's refer to OSHA for that question. I think that's definitely an OSHA question. Good. I'm honored that so many of you have hung in there, and I hope you learned new information. I hope you reach out to me if you have any feedback. I think they're going to start collecting feedback about this particular webinar here in a minute or so. Can you send a link of this presentation so I can share it with my staff? As soon as we get the presentation posted, I think we can do that. We'll put that up on our website, and when we post the presentation on YouTube, we can actually put those links right on top of it so that it'll show. And for all of you who signed up for this webinar, when you get a link to the posted presentation after, we'll make sure you get a link to that YouTube one as well.